Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our Winter 2022 season of the Virtual Museum Lecture Series presented by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Our community is filled with diverse stories, and we recognize that our story begins with the Indigenous peoples of this land. We acknowledge that we are broadcasting this lecture on lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for millennia. And we would like to honor the centuries of Indigenous peoples who walked on Turtle Island before us. Good evening, everyone. My name is Adrian Petrie, Visitor Services Coordinator here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Welcome back to the series, and a special welcome to any audience members out there who are new to this series. Thank you for joining us. We hope these lectures provide a bit of historical joy and also spark imagination and exploration into our city's rich history. There are so many ways to join in the historical fun and get your local history fix. You can view all the past lectures on our YouTube channel and playlist. And you can listen to the lecture audio on our podcast, VMLS Via Podcast, which you can find anywhere you get your podcasts under STC Museum Podcasts. Not including tonight, we only have 2 remaining lectures for the spring or for the winter 2022 lecture series. Details of the lineup were included in the VMLS email today and are on our website, stcatharinesmuseum.ca. As always, please feel free to make use of the chat box to ask questions or send comments. We'll moderate them during and at the end of the presentation. There is a slight delay in the broadcast, so if we miss your question, we'll get to it at the end of the presentation. We so appreciate you joining the lecture series, and we would equally appreciate a donation in support of your programming, in support of our programming. Your donations help us to continue to provide the high quality and enjoyable programming that you've come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation that you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880. Or visit the donation portal on our active STC page to make a donation. The link for the portal was included in the VMLS email today. Your donation makes a difference. Thank you. And now I'm very happy to welcome to the lecture series special guest, Dr. Roy Finkenbein. Roy E. Finkenbein is a professor of history, co-chair of the History Department, and director of the Black Abolitionist Archive at the University of Detroit Mercy. He teaches courses in African American history, modern Africa, slave resistance, the Civil War era, and the Underground Railroad. He received his doctorate from Bowling Green State University in 1982 and joined the Detroit Mercy faculty in 1996. While on the editorial staff of the Black Abolitionist Papers Project at Florida State University in the 1980s and 1990s, he co-edited the 5-volume Black Abolitionist Papers, 1830 to 1865, between 1985 and 1992, and Witness for Freedom, African American Voices on Race, Slavery, and Emancipation in 1993. He's authored sources on the African American past, in 1997 and 2004, as well as over a dozen articles and book chapters related to the Black abolitionists and the Underground Railroad. Professor Finkenbein has consulted on museum exhibits, documentary films, and television programs on aspects of African American history. His op-eds have appeared in the History News Network, Time, Newsweek, Portside.org, Raw Story, Alternate, and Faithfully Magazine, as well as CBC News, I should add, just for the Canadian content. Currently, Professor Finkenbein is completing a book entitled The Indigenous Underground Railroad, Freedom Seekers in Indian Country. I apologize. He is, and that will be the topic of his talk tonight. He is on the editorial board of the Michigan Historical Review, the Michigan Freedom Trial Commission, the planning team for the International Underground Railroad Month, and the advisory board for the Slave Stampedes Project. Joining us from Detroit, I believe, or Michigan at least, I am very happy to welcome Dr. Finkenbein. And Take it away, Roy.
Trying to start the video. There we go. Well, hello. I am going to just say a few words and then I will bring up my
We're still missing your video. Let me see if that.
yeah, I don't know. I was trying to start it and the line just keeps there and it just keeps saying yeah, the host has muted you, or the host has stopped you or something.
Let me see if I can. There we go. Excellent.
Okay, there we go.
Awesome. All right, I'll be in the background. Let me know if you need any assistance.
Well, thank you, and welcome to everyone out there. Looking forward to sharing some of these things with you. I've had kind of a wonderful opportunity dumped in my lap to learn all sorts of interesting things throughout my 40-year career, and this last one is the most unexpected in the sense that I have worked for a long time with African American history and particularly the Underground Railroad, but I have not done much of anything on Native American or, in the case of Canada, First Nations history. And I was asked to do a book chapter for a book that was published in 2018, looking at where I came from in terms of Northwest Ohio and the interaction between Native Americans and freedom seekers there. And I did it, it was published, and I thought, well, this is done. And then I found from publishers and readers and a bunch of other people, wow, this is new stuff and this is interesting. And I started looking further. And despite a lot of roadblocks in finding this kind of information, found that there is a story to tell. In this case, it's a story that I'm focusing in my book on, very much the Old Northwest, what we today know as the American Midwest. But it has very much a Canadian nexus, an Ontario nexus, and I'll be sharing some of that in the story as well. Let me bring up my PowerPoint. Okay. Well, the story is one that's largely unknown. In fact, I've referred to it as a hidden history. An authority on, and now past, unfortunately, but an authority on African American and Native American interaction in the Upper Great Lakes region was asked in a scholarly interview in 2009 something about this, and she says what you see on the screen there. Helen Hornbeck Tanner, who is best known for a lot of works, but best known for something called the Atlas of Great Lakes Indian History. It was published in 1987 and is a wonderful resource for people on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes as well as the American side of the Great Lakes. And she said an important example of African or African American and Indian cooperation was the Indian operated Underground Railroad. Nothing about this activity appears in the historical literature. And in fact, that's largely true. Native American assistance to freedom seekers crossing through the Midwest, then often called the Old Northwest, into Canada, or seeking sanctuary in Indian villages in the region. This has largely been erased from Underground Railroad studies. A couple of key examples here to prove my point. The first volume, Wilbur Siebert's pioneering Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom in 1898, and it's still used. I mean, this man made a contribution, but he missed the Native American part of it. Still a beginning point for many who investigate efforts to assist freedom seekers in the pre-Civil War Midwest. He collected testimony from hundreds of participants and witnesses in the struggle, and he converted this documentary record then into this broad and influential work that's still in print 124 years later. Exactly 2 sentences in a work of 358 pages discusses the aid given to freedom seekers by Native Americans. In this case, a particular Native American village on the Maumee River in Northwest Ohio. Well, fast forward nearly 11 decades to the second major work, perhaps the most extensive and authoritative Underground Railroad interpretation since Siebert, Bound for Canaan, the Underground Railroad and the War for the Soul of America by Fergus Bordovich in 2005. He only does slightly better. He included 4 sentences out of 439 pages on the assistance given to freedom seekers by Native Americans. Readers of these 2 volumes could be excused for thinking that there was little interaction between freedom seekers and Native Americans in the Midwest. What I want to do in this presentation is try to answer 4 questions. 1, why has this story been erased? What sources exist to tell this story? How did Native Americans assist freedom seekers? And why did they assist freedom seekers? Well, why has this story been erased? I think there are 2 main reasons, at least that I've been able to identify. And the first is that both African American freedom seekers fleeing slavery in the South, particularly the Upper South, and Native Americans who assisted them in the Old Northwest, the contemporary American Midwest, came from primarily oral cultures. Historians have tended to privilege archival evidence, written records, printed records over oral testimony. And part of that is a bias towards the written word. And part of that is a bias against, I guess, accepting the historical memory, the historicity that exists in oral cultures. In the case of the freedom seekers, we know that among enslaved African Americans in the American South, fewer than 10%, maybe closer to 5% of them were literate. Some who escaped became literate, and there may have been a higher percentage than 5% among the freedom seekers, but it still was a small minority of the whole. Native American cultures before the mid-19th century in particular were largely oral, with the exception of, as I'm finding, folks who had converted to Christianity and become, among the Ojibwa, the Ottawa or Odawa, and a host of other groups, people who would become ministers and missionaries to their peoples, who often left memoirs and things like this once they became literate. Second, local histories, including the large volume of county histories produced across the Midwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, start the clock with white settlement. There was an effort by publishing companies in Chicago and New York and other places in the late 19th and early 20th century to get counties across the Midwest to write and publish their county histories. Who was writing them? Aging white settlers and the children of these white settlers. They began the story with their story. Here's a map, perhaps the most widely used map of Ohio, this 1815 Alexander Bourne map, most widely used map from its time. And you can see it's broken down into counties, implying settlement. And then you see this big hole up in the upper left hand, the northwest part of Ohio. That by treaty was a series of Native American reserves. And it's shown on the map as devoid of anything, basically, other than some land and water features. and you wouldn't get the sense that there were, thousands of Native Americans living there at the time. So they start the clock with white settlement. Those county histories that do mention Native Americans at all mention them as predecessors and basically clear them off the land by the time you get to the War of 1812 and out of the story, even though we know that in the lower Midwest, states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, Indian removal did not come till the 1830s and 1840s. Finally, but in the upper Great Lakes region, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indian removal was very limited. And so they still were there up through the Civil War, aiding freedom seekers. Look at this quote. This is a book on called Winning the West with Words, Language and Conquest in the Lower Great Lakes, which looks at how Native Americans were removed from the story of these areas of white settlement. And I've kind of reinforced this with my own work, looking at, spent some time at the Ohio Historical Society reading room, reading through county histories from more than a dozen counties in Northwest Ohio. And I found the same thing. It's like this, Indians are there, they leave before the white man settles. And so he is settling on, quote, virgin land. And you see this quote, Theodore Roosevelt, who fancied himself a historian, The Winning of the West: "The white settler has merely moved into an uninhabited waste. He does not feel he is committing a wrong, for he knows perfectly well that the land is really owned by no one." So clock starts with white settlement in the portrayal of these local community histories. Well, what sources exist to tell the story? As I began to unpack and see that there was a story to tell, I found a number of things that led me to believe that we could recapture the story. And one is simple geography. And Canada factors in here in many ways, because going through places like Ohio and Indiana, the north-south routes that settlers took and that freedom seekers took were originally Native American trails. And these trails either went through or by Native American villages. And this is a quote that that points this up. Taya Miles of Harvard, who recently won the National Book Award for nonfiction, and speaking of the geography of the Underground Railroad, she says, "The routes that escaping slaves took went by these native communities." Geography suggests that it would have been possible for the two to miss each other. And sometimes, as I found in the evidence, it was simply freedom seekers and Native Americans bumping into each other on the trails through places like Ohio and Indiana. Here's an example. You see, this is the Wyandotte Grand Reserve in northwest Ohio. The Wyandotte Grand Reserve is northwest of Columbus, Ohio. You see the Sandusky River, and immediately left of the Sandusky River, routes running northward. The main one there through Upper Sandusky, which is a Wyandotte village. You go about 6 miles north of that, and you see the red underlined Negro Town. Negro Town was a Black community made up of free Blacks and a lot of freedom seekers who settled under the protection of the Wyandotte between the 1790s and the 1840s. And this reserve continued until 1843, when the Wyandotte were removed to the Trans-Mississippi West. Another source that can be effectively mined are the slave narratives. A few of the freedom seekers were able to get an education, became literate, and became activists for the movement. If you are Canadian and you don't know Josiah Henson, you should. Josiah Henson is an enslaved African-American, originally from Maryland. His master moved him to Kentucky. He was an extremely loyal slave, and in fact, thought that he had arranged with his master to purchase his freedom, which he did over time with odd jobs and raising funds. And when he almost got to the point of buying his freedom, his master took the money and claimed that there was no such agreement, at which point Josiah Henson stopped being the loyal slave and made plans to escape with his family. They got another slave to row them across the Ohio River under cover of darkness. They wandered without much knowledge of the terrain through southern Indiana, finally found their way to Cincinnati, where abolitionists helped them get northward a little bit and then pointed them in a direction. And they got on one of the main trails, something called Hull's Trace, which took them northward and ultimately bumped into, right as they were at the end of their rope and running out of supplies, bumped into Native Americans in Northwest Ohio. I believe probably Wyandotte, although the slave narrative doesn't indicate what kinds of Indians, what tribal group, but they were welcomed in, cared for, allowed to refresh, and eventually taken along the route many, many miles and pointed towards Sandusky, which is a major port on the south shore of Lake Erie, where they were able to get a friendly ship's captain to give them passage across to what was then called Upper Canada, today's Ontario. The Hensons weren't the only ones that crossed into Canada via Lake Erie. On the right, you see Germain Logwin, another enslaved African-American from Tennessee, escaped with a man named John Farney. They made it through Kentucky. They got across the river, and with the help of a series of willing souls in the southern two-thirds of Indiana, Black settlements, Quaker settlements, and others, they made their way up to Logansport, which was this kind of Wild West river port on the Wabash River. And once they crossed over, they were in Potawatomi territory. And the Potawatomi helped them extensively, welcomed them in, even though they were strangers, cared for them. This is as winter's coming on, and helped them get through Indiana and southern Michigan. Caused me in the course of the study to have to, both through books and through discussions with Potawatomi elders, to learn a lot about the nature of the custom of Potawatomi hospitality then and now. Logwin and Farney eventually made it through a blinding snowstorm to Detroit. Farney disappears from the record at that point, but Logwin made it into Upper Canada, spent a while there, and eventually became a Black abolitionist in upstate New York, and wrote his slave narrative. A third of these evidences is the oral tradition. And I found a lot of help by examining the oral tradition, both that which has eventually been recorded on paper or on audio. And in the midst of COVID and finding my way restricted, I increasingly became dependent on virtual interviews with Indigenous families who shared traditions of helping freedom seekers, groups and individual Indigenous elders, and the like, and found my way to things like this book, which was a notable Michigan book a little less than 2 decades ago, The Indians of Hungary Hollow, which was recorded by an Ojibwa woman, writer and artist named Marcia Blackledge, which teased out the oral stories of a World War II veteran and Odawa storyteller named Bill Dunlop, and ultimately put this in the form of a book, The Indians of Hungary Hollow. I will share the chapter that's coming out from my vetting of that story in that book, in which he tells about helping freedom seekers to get from southwestern Michigan to the Upper Peninsula and into central Ontario. I'll discuss this more in a moment. But I found in my own virtual interviews a reinforcement for this idea that, and could actually establish provenance of how this was passed down from great grandparents to grandparents to parents to children, the stories of helping freedom seekers in the Upper Great Lakes region, particularly found among the Ottawa or Odawa, as we often say in Michigan, and the Ojibwa or Chippewa. A fourth of these evidences comes from the memoirs, letters, and journals of white, particularly observant whites who recorded information about Native Americans they interviewed or encountered. These were traders, trappers, missionaries, soldiers, and increasingly I'm finding 19th century explorers that fit this bill, geologists and others who just happen in the course of their explorations to interview Indian figures about customs, and have gotten several wonderful explanations that were recorded in some of these antiquarian books of Native American attitudes towards race, their feelings about hospitality, why they welcomed in these strangers who didn't necessarily look like them, and a whole range of things, as well as certain incidents which are good examples of this aid. Particularly instructive example appears in the memoir of Eliza Porter of Wisconsin. She and her husband Jeremiah were missionaries in Green Bay, and they cooperated with Native Americans on the Stockbridge Reservation east of Lake Winnebago in aiding fugitive slaves making their way through eastern Wisconsin to Great Lake ports like Green Bay in the 1850s. On one occasion, detailed in Porter's memoir, they assisted a family of 4 runaways from Missouri in avoiding slave catchers and bounty hunters said to be sneaking around the Stockbridge Reservation. The Stockbridge helped their guests make their way to Green Bay and gain passage on the steamer Michigan, which carried them to freedom in what was then called Canada West, and they landed at Sarnia. A final evidence that's becoming increasingly important in my research appears in the bodies of freedom seekers and Native Americans and their descendants, genealogy and DNA evidence. This takes us into the realm of those two things, and particularly applies to those freedom seekers who sought permanent sanctuary in Native American villages. For instance, a Shawnee genealogist named Don Green has found extensive evidence of African American ancestry among the Shawnee in the region. A case in point is Caesar. Caesar is a Virginia fugitive who escaped across the Appalachian Mountains to the Ohio country in 1774, was adopted by the Shawnee. He married a mixed-race Shawnee woman named Sally and fathered children known to history the two that are most recorded as, quote, Sally's white son and Sally's black son due to their difference in hue. The latter is still listed as Sally's black son on the roll of Shawnee migrants removed from their Ohio reservation to the Oklahoma frontier in 1832. And let me tell you a couple things particularly germane there. One is Caesar and then his two sons that we know the most about, Sally's white son and Sally's black son, fought extensively with the Shawnee and other tribal groups to try to hold on to the Ohio country and then the broader Old Northwest, and were involved in many of the battles from the 1770s up to the 1790s in the case of Caesar. His sons fought with Tecumseh. They were at Prophetstown, Indiana, fought with Tecumseh before the War of 1812, with Tecumseh and the British and the Pan-Indian Alliance in the War of 1812. Eventually, Sally's white son settled around Amherstburg on the Canadian side. Sally's black son was there for a while, but in 1825, he came back to the Shawnee, one of the Shawnee reserves in Northwest Ohio. And in 1832, as I ultimately found out, he was taken with the Shawnee removed to the Trans-Mississippi West. And I found that in the most curious way. Sometimes serendipity is a historian's best friend. My wife and I in 2017 were down near Cincinnati, and we went to see an exhibit called Exiled, which was put together by a professor from Xavier University, and was basically telling the story of Shawnee and Wyandotte removal from Ohio to the Trans-Mississippi West. And in one of the display cases, there was a ledger kept by one of the federal agents who accompanied the Shawnee westward. And it just happened to be blocked open to a representative page. This was not a ledger I knew about. It happened to be not in the usual archives. And as I'm scanning down the page, I see a notation for Sally's black son. I thought, wow, what a find. And it allowed me to then tell the further story of that particular figure. But genealogy can help in other ways, and so can emerging DNA research. For example, increasingly we're finding that a particular chromosome, the RM173Y chromosome, which is largely found in people of African descent, also turns up in high percentages in Native American groups that had a lot of interaction with freedom seekers, taking them into their villages, intermarrying, etc. And in the upper Great Lakes region, the Ojibwa, for example, 89% of self-identified Ojibwa have this particular chromosome in their genetic makeup. Therefore, there was a lot of interaction between African Americans, particularly freedom seekers, and the Ojibwa. Well, some subjects of historical research can be substantiated by investigating a single archive or a few, but in the case of Native Americans, we have to look to a range of different sources: DNA, genealogy, oral tradition, and a host of other geography and a host of other things. Well, how did Native Americans assist freedom seekers? Well, some, as I said, sought sanctuary in Native American villages. Other freedom seekers received assistance from Native Americans as they crossed the Midwest to Canada. Which alternative a freedom seeker could choose often depended on time, geography, personal choice, and the proximity of friendly Indians. And here's a point I should mention. Not all tribal groups in the Midwest helped freedom seekers, and we'll talk about why certain did in a little bit. Well, let me share the story of a particular incident, and that is something that takes place in Michigan and involves Canada, and it occurs in the 1830s. It actually represents a chapter in my book, and I think it's a very useful one for telling the story about how did Native Americans assist freedom seekers. This is a scene of the Grand River in southwestern Michigan, not far from, in fact, incorporates part of contemporary Grand Rapids, Michigan, Michigan's second largest city. Just to the left of the picture, there actually was a Ottawa village. There were two on different parts of the rapids in Grand Rapids. The South Village, as this was called, was also known as Chief Blackskin's Village. And in 1833, 20 freedom seekers showed up at Chief Blackskin's Village seeking assistance. Now, there's a whole lot of things you can unpack from this. Chief Blackskin was a leading opponent of white settlement, acculturation of white ways, treaties with the federal government, etc. And in 1833, white settlement was moving quickly up to the southern side of the Grand River, and the South Village, Chief Blackskin's Village, was on the other side of the river, still trying to hold on. Fearing that slave catchers would try to cross the river and look for these slave catchers, there were long discussions in the Longhouse about how they should deal with this issue. Native American anti-slavery meetings, you might say. They talked about the evils of slavery, the need to help other oppressed people that were coming from the South, and ultimately the Blackskin and other elders devised a plan. They sent messengers up to Little Traverse Bay in the northwestern part of the Lower Peninsula and said, can you send some people to escort them northward out of harm's way? And they did ultimately. 10 men from Little Traverse Bay villages and Burt Lake, which is nearby, came down the length of the Lower Peninsula, almost the length, to Grand Rapids, and accompanied the freedom seekers northward. Now, here's a rough map I put together. I'm actually in the process of adjusting this because it appears that they went kind of northwestward to Lake Michigan and followed the coastline pretty much until they got to the strait, the Mackinac Strait between the upper and lower peninsula. They came to the strait and crossed there in canoe. Apparently, by the time they were at the strait and handed off to a group of Ojibwa escorts, the Odawa handed them off to Ojibwa escorts, they were put into these large war canoes and taken across the 5-mile Mackinac Strait under cover of darkness. And I've tried to put myself in the shoes of the 20 freedom seekers, thinking, well, we don't know where we're going. We just met these people who are escorting us. need to close my eyes and just have a little faith. It must have been a bit of fear and trepidation on their part, but hopefully they'd learned to trust the Odawa by the time that they were handed off. If you look back at this map, you'll see that they then crossed to the Upper Peninsula, about where St. Ignace is today, and then went through a couple of Ojibwa villages, reaching an island called Nebish Island, immediately south of Sault Ste. Marie, and crossed into central Ontario. Now, we don't know where they ended up, but both the historical evidence from the 1830s and a few interviews that I've been able to do with contemporary Ojibwa suggest it probably was Manitoulin Island, which is the largest island that you see there on the Canadian side of Lake Huron. It was an Ojibwa and Odawa reserve for a good while in the 19th century. One of the things I found from consulting with Canadian indigenous scholars, as well as looking at a lot of sources from the time, is that one of the great uncovered aspects of Canadian history really is the welcome that many freedom seekers received from First Nations peoples. Canadian Indigenous scholars talk about Black Ojibwa people in central Ontario. Similarly, we know that there was some interaction in southwestern Ontario between freedom seekers and Ojibwa. Further east towards Hamilton, along Canada's Grand River, there's archival evidence of freedom seekers that came through the Niagara portal being essentially integrated into Six Nations communities along the Grand River. So there is a welcome, there is a Canadian Afro First Nations story to tell. Why am I able to tell this story? Well, a lot of archival research, but primarily oral tradition. That book I mentioned earlier, The Indians of Hungary Hollow, is where Bill Dunlop passes along in many sessions with Marcia Blackledge, this Ojibwa writer, the story that had been passed down. And I've been able to trace the provenance of this story. One of the people in the line of provenance, the first one, is a man by the name of Mixabe, who's one of the 10 that accompany, one of the 10 Odawa that accompany the freedom seekers northward in the story. His son, Louis Mixabe, is a boy at the time of the Underground Railroad story depicted in the tale. And he continues to tell the story for generations. He later passes the story to his son, John Mixaba. They tried to Europeanize it. And John Mixaba regaled Odawa audiences with it in the 1930s on back porches and barbershops and you name it. That's where Bill Dunlop, as a young man, first hears the story and incorporates it into his repertoire. I've come across other Odawa families that told the story. I've come across Ojibwa families that know the tale. More broadly, I've interviewed Ojibwa families and been able to trace through generations their telling of the broader story of helping freedom seekers coming through that northern portal, the Upper Peninsula. And Marcia Blackledge, who was the writer who assisted Bill Dunlop in getting this oral tradition into print, went on a book tour in 2004 after the book came out. And at points, she would have African-American folks come up to her after the talk and say, that sounds amazingly like an oral tradition that we passed down in our family. So, I've been able to vet many aspects of the story against archival research and vital statistics research and a whole range of other things. But, the key point is oral tradition has become crucial for keeping this story alive, analyzing it into the broader tale, and finding ways to demonstrate the African-American, Native American intersection on the Underground Railroad. Well, why did Native Americans assist freedom seekers? Well, I think it probably emerged from a variety of factors. As the population of Native American villages in the Midwest declined in the early 19th century, Native Americans found it advantageous to welcome freedom seekers who brought additional skills, knowledge, technologies, seeds, foods, bloodlines into their villages, just as white captives and captives from other tribal groups had done a century earlier. As my own research on the Ottawa and the Maumee River Valley in Northwest Ohio has shown, the Ottawa expected freedom seekers living among them to contribute in a variety of ways for the benefit of the entire community. In Kinjuana's town, which is on the Maumee River, which it actually saw its population halved in the decade of the 1820s, and fugitive slaves, mostly male, could enrich the community's bloodlines and keep the community going. This view is confirmed by Canadian Indigenous scholars Zainab Amahadi and Bonita Lawrence, who observed that, quote, Indigenous communities looked to African newcomers as people who could inject new life, new blood, and new ideas into nations threatened by European disease and genocidal policies. Africans who spoke the languages of the settlers and knew their battle tactics were an asset to many communities defending themselves against or negotiating European aggression. So part of it's self-interest, particularly by the time you get to the 19th century, but it's more than that. Native Americans of the Upper Great Lakes felt a sense of kinship with the freedom seekers they encountered, often referring to them as brothers or cousins. Ojibwa Methodist missionary John Hall told African Americans after the Civil War that, quote, old Indians used to call colored men cousins. This usually came from an awareness of common suffering at the hands of white settlement and expansion. Hall observed that, quote, Indians are poor just like blacks are, and we stand on one platform. We have suffered just the same. See an image here of Peter Jones, another Ojibwa Methodist missionary, and he believed that Native American, quote, comes next to the Negro in the endurance of wrongs inflicted by the white man. Jones claimed that antebellum Ojibwa frequently referred to freedom seekers as, quote, our fellow suffering brethren. As a result, they, quote, deeply commiserated with their plight. There seems to be, throughout many Native American groups in the Midwest, by the antebellum or pre-Civil War period, a growing indigenous concern with slavery in the South. Historian Arvin Smallwood has noted that, quote, as slavery spread and the cruelty of slavery became known among Native Americans, many began to sympathize with Africans and despise the institution of slavery. Many Indian nations began to harbor runaway slaves, unquote. Again, Jones claimed that a major reason for Ojibwa hospitality towards African Americans was, quote, their unhappy state in being bound with the iron band of slavery, quote, unquote. In my own research, I've located extensive evidence of anti-slavery meetings after 1830 among the Stockbridge and the Brotherton in Wisconsin and the Ottawa in Michigan, which define this link between opposition to slavery and a motivation to help freedom seekers among Indians in the Midwest. This is very different from what occurred south of the Ohio River, where the attitudes and actions of Native Americans towards runaways differed greatly. Although Southern freedom seekers had sometimes found welcome in Native American towns during the 18th century, by the beginning of the 19th century, this hospitality had disappeared. During the antebellum years, most escaped slaves reaching Native American villages were re-enslaved or returned to their owners for their reward. Many Southern Native American tribes held slaves themselves in this era, even after their removal west of the Mississippi River in the 1830s. As historian Christina Snyder had noted in the South, quote, bondage in Indian country mirrored the slavery practiced by their white neighbors, unquote. Circumstances in the Midwest and Canada differed greatly from that of the slave South. There, between the American Revolution and the Civil War, Native Americans assisted freedom seekers by providing them sanctuary in their villages and assisting those crossing through Indian country to Canada. The relationship fully demonstrated the, quote, coexistence and cooperation which Helen Hornbeck Tanner spoke of nearly 2 decades ago. I hope this has been instructive, and I would, with Adrian's help, love to try to answer some of your questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Finkenbein. That was absolutely fascinating. I know there's a comment in the chat box that says fascinating. So I speak for the audience when I say that was wonderful. While we wait for some questions, and I have a few myself, excuse me, I will just wrap us up here with some of our end of lecture housekeeping things, and we'll hopefully get some questions into the chat box while we wait. So again, thank you very much. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, again, please consider making a donation to the museum so that we can continue to provide the high quality programming you expect from us. We really appreciate any donation that you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880 or visit the donation portal on our active SDC page to make a donation. The link for the donation portal was included in the VMLS email today. Your donation makes a difference. Thank you. We'd also like to remind everyone to please like, follow, subscribe on all of our social media channels, including here on YouTube, but also on WordPress, our podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy our content, please share it in your networks to help more of our community join in the historical adventures. Next time on the Virtual Museum Lecture Series, we are excited to welcome back our own Kathleen Powell, curator here at the St. Catharines Museum, to talk about the fascinating local response to Canada's khaki election of 1917. Khaki election of 1917, one of Canada's most contentious elections. And you thought some recent elections were contentious. Just wait till you hear about the election from 1917. I've sort of been a backseat passenger on Kathleen's research, and this is a lecture you won't want to miss. The Virtual Museum Lecture Series, of course, is presented by us here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center and the City of St. Catharines. And now I'm happy to take some questions from the chat box. I have some questions as well. Kathy had a question too. So we will get to some of those. All right. Belle in the chat box says, quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Would you say that that's right on the money for a description of those types of relationships?
Yeah, in fact, in common parlance, I've used that in describing this situation. They sensed that they were both under, if not equal, under similar oppression from white settler colonialism, and so they saw freedom seekers as allies or potential allies. And I think that one of the things that factors in there as well is in looking at Potawatomi hospitality. One of the things I've learned about that is you have an obligation to help the stranger unless they are seen as antagonistic or an enemy. And Potawatomi and others saw white settler colonialism as antagonistic and an enemy. But these poor freedom seekers who were just fleeing oppression were cousins and brothers and kin, and you see all these kinds of language used. Yeah. The other thing I find, and I've seen this in the Dakota Sioux and in the Ojibwa, both in the Upper Great Lakes region, is examples where leaders will talk about race and downplay Blackness as having any significance in the equation. These are people just like us. They're created by the Great Spirit, and unlike white America at the time, race doesn't factor in.
Right. That's really, really interesting. The cultural differences are fascinating because, for example, a lot of as you were pointing out, a lot of the historical sources compartmentalize the story from, the clock. I love that phrase. I'm going to steal that phrase. The clock starts at, white settlement. And they compartmentalize that history chronologically, culturally, socially. And it's always good to hear, not a surprise to most of us on this, our audience is quite well educated now after all these lectures, but it's always a good reminder to that these cultures and peoples coexisted and interacted, and that is always, or not always, but sometimes a surprise to people, not for only because of the gaps in the history. And I wonder if that's a normal reaction that you hear from people when you talk about this history is, what are, how come I didn't learn about this, or how come this is so hidden, and is that a normal reaction?
Well, yeah, I think, all of those things. One is, why didn't I know this? Why didn't I hear about this in grade school, in high school, in college? Why is this new stuff to me? Also, I think people dealing with the notion, you're right about compartmentalization. History is messy, and particularly, when you try to break things in, compartmentalize different racial groups, that's not the way the world works. And in the Midwest, in terms of early settlement on the ground, whether it be Native American villages, black settlements, white settlements, they were all there and sometimes mixed together, in early 19th century American Midwest. Annalisa Cox, whose name you may or may not have heard of, she's written extensively as a book called The Bone and Sinew of the Land, which got a lot of attention a few years ago. She found like hundreds and hundreds of black settlements across the Midwest, from Wisconsin to Ohio to Michigan to Indiana. And her argument, which she documents very clearly, she says the Midwest was very diverse, and then it became less so. We think of the Midwest, particularly the rural Midwest, as and you may have this idea in parts of Canada, I don't know, but the rural Midwest is very white.
Yeah, yes, that's my perception.
And when you look in the history of community after community after community, they were very diverse early on.
Right.
And then, events made them less so.
Yes. Interesting. That's actually a good segue to another question. Was you talked about Sally's black son being expelled to the West with the indigenous peoples that he was with. Did you ever find other examples of other Black folks who were also sort of went along or were expelled as well?
Well, I wasn't tracing, particular ones in most of the chapters, but there are lots of examples that, the great, another hidden part of the story is in America, when we think about Indian removal, we think about the Cherokee and the Creeks and all those, quote, 5 civilized tribes from the American Southeast.
Yeah.
And they get the focus, even in Ohio colleges, you're teaching that in American history classes.
Your own backyard.
You totally ignore the fact that same things happening to the Wyandotte and the Shawnee and the Ottawa and the Potawatomi and the Miami and et cetera across the lower Midwest. And yeah, there are thousands removed ultimately. The interesting thing is, by the time you get to the 1840s, the federal government seems to be less concerned about removing the Native Americans from the Upper Great Lakes region. They put them on reserves, but they allow them to stay in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and so forth, which then changes the story for freedom seekers, because they're not getting assistance from Native Americans for the most part in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. But if they can make it to Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they can get help.
That's so neat. Oh my gosh. Okay, other side of the Great Lakes. There's a couple questions about some of the assistance provided in Canada. So a couple questions was, if you have any more examples about sort of Indigenous peoples receiving freedom seekers from other Indigenous, the sort of the baton handing off. So is there any evidence of freedom seekers receiving assistance from the Moravian settlement on the Thames River, where, and I believe that's where Tecumseh would have died, years earlier. And then also, I'm really glad to hear of first Six Nations example here in our area. Is that something that, was it sort of like, we'll leave you at the border and you're off on your own, or is it like a passing of the baton and sort of what kind of coordination, I guess, and what kind of assistance was involved?
Well, once they crossed the border, sometimes there was more formal assistance from First Nations, but a lot of times it's simply these were areas beyond white settlement. Freedom seekers went up and they were kind of allowed. I see the same thing. The other, my final chapter is a story in Michigan, which I can comment on in a moment. Yeah. But allowed to settle there, and over time, things happen like things happen. People who are neighbors start to interact and intermarry.
Yes.
A whole host of other things, and then they get integrated together, and so you have what I've used the term Afro First Nations populations emerging.
Right. That it's absolutely fascinating.
If I could just tell you briefly the story on the Michigan side.
Yes.
And it blew my mind when I discovered it. It's in the very far northwest of the Lower Peninsula, communities Charlevoix, Petoskey, et cetera. There's people in Michigan would know them, and we mark them on the hand as to where they are. You know that?
Yep. I know.
But a guy named William Swan, who was a runaway from Virginia, and he made it to southwestern Indiana, but too many slave catchers and other things, black laws, etc. And so at the beginning of the Civil War, he and his wife and daughter, he ultimately has many other children, but they go up to northwestern Michigan. Now, this is an area that, according to the census, they are the first Black family to ever settle there. Where do they settle? They settle in a community that is a blended community of Ojibwa and Odawa converts, settled around a church run by a Ojibwa missionary named Peter Greensky. And ultimately, they welcome this guy. He's squatting on their land, but they welcome him. They show him how to work this land. This guy shows up with his family, but no work animals, no knowledge of clearing pine trees, and all these kinds of things. And they help him make a go of his farm. When at one point has some damage to his buildings. They come help him rebuild it. In 1870, after the war is over, white settlers post-Civil War have started to move up into there, and there's hostilities. And they actually kill this guy. And, they do two things. One, no white churchyards or other areas up there and there isn't really a Black community. So nobody's going to take him in and bury him. So they bury him in what is otherwise an all Native American churchyard. And they put up a stone marker that unfortunately was destroyed in winter 2019. I saw the marker fortunately beforehand and had a photo, but it was this huge branch comes down and blasts smithereens. Yes. But it basically, the marker, gives his names and tentative dates, and they call him a Green Sky brother. In other words, in death, they're incorporating him in. But they also keep the family going and keep the farm going until relatives can come from further south. I mean, it's this beautiful story of Native Americans exhibiting the best kind of neighborliness.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's great. One thing before I got just a couple more questions before I let you go and let everybody go. And this more maybe a philosophical question, but what should we be doing as a historical community, in your opinion, to rectify the situation of this forgotten history?
Well, I'm of the opinion that what we believe happened in the past shapes who we are in the present and what we might become in the future. So I think it's very important to tell these stories, tell them as broadly as we can, get them right, and bring them to the surface. And I think, there are, just like with this William Swan story, there are beautiful elements in these stories that can show us how to live and act in the present, and that this isn't something, racial tensions isn't necessarily a given. So I think, you started with an acknowledgement, which is very appropriate at the beginning. In the preface I'm writing, I'm saying this is my attempt at acknowledgement of, these two groups that we've kind of shut out of history, and to bring them in and to show how they exhibited some just amazing sense of kinship. They could show us the way. And the preface, I start with a line from an American colonial historian where he talks about something called beneficiaries of catastrophe. And I start with saying, I'm a beneficiary of catastrophe. And then I show that how I've come to realize that I'm a beneficiary of white settler colonialism in Western Ohio, and how the land that I grew up on actually has provided me with all sorts of privilege and opportunities, including the chance to go to college and grad school and so forth, which I probably wouldn't have otherwise had. But it was the fruits of the land that used to belong to somebody else that allowed this to happen.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's very inspiring. Thank you very much. Where can we find your book when it comes out?
Well, I've had half dozen publishers that are interested, but I've made a decision that until I have the final, I'm not going to
don't put the
cart
on
the publisher.
Yeah, the cart before the horse. Yeah.
I think the what I end up with will help determine, who's interested and who's willing.
Yes, that's wonderful. One last thing before I go is actually promoting another lecture we've had in the past. We talked about Jermaine Logan and Josiah Henson, local historian Rochelle Bush in our previous series last year gave a wonderful lecture about the abolitionists who came through St. Catharines. So to our audience who maybe should be a little bit more familiar with those two gentlemen, as well as a few others, including Harriet Tubman, should definitely check out that lecture. As most of you probably know, St. Catharines was a sort of a hub and a destination for abolitionist activities, meetings, and all that sorts of things. So thank you very much. There's tons of thank yous all through the chat box. Roy, thank you so much, Roy, for joining us for the lecture series. This has been a real treat.
I enjoyed it. And if I can just say one thing about
Yes,
this
absolutely.
gentleman, you know, I had the opportunity because of CBC and other things and some familiarity out there about this, to be on the fourth episode of it was done by a Canadian production company, but it was on Science Channel and Discovery Plus, called The Underground Railroad: A Secret History. And we talked a bit about Henson and that. And one of the things I said, and I'll apply it to Logwin as well, is if it wasn't for Native American assistance, we probably would not know those two folks.
Very good. Yeah, see that, like, it's almost an origin story in that way, and that's so important to their story and their connection here. And that's something that we don't talk about. Like, we don't really know that end of it. So it's really, really great, and I really appreciate this. This is absolutely fascinating, and I very much appreciate you participating in the series. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Roy. And of course, everybody, if you can share this recording far and wide, get that message out about these early histories that are forgotten, so that they can stop being forgotten. All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evening. Thank you, Roy. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.